bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the August 24th, 2023 podcast. There are more than 3,000 public housing authorities, or PHAs, in the United States. And those PHAs own and operate nearly 1 million public housing apartments. Now, the vast majority of PHAs were formed to own and operate public housing, and they continue to do so. Some owning thousands of apartments, others just a handful. Now, that said, roughly 10% of PHAs do not own public housing. PHAs, whether or not they own public housing, are generally involved in a variety of other affordable housing programs overseen by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. For instance, a vast majority of PHAs are local administrators for housing choice vouchers. Housing choice vouchers provide tenant-based and project-based rental assistance. Now, that said, most housing choice vouchers are tenant-based, funded under HUD's Section 8 program. About 2.3 million low-income families receive rental assistance under the Section 8 program. That constitutes nearly 2% of families in the nation. If you're involved in affordable housing, you likely know that housing choice vouchers are frequently used at properties financed by low-income housing tax credit equity. This means that PHAs play a role even in privately owned affordable housing. Now, the operations of many PHAs has been transformed over the past decade due to the opportunities provided by HUD's Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, or RAD. RAD allows public housing authorities to leverage public and private debt and equity to reinvest in the public housing stock. Now, this often takes the form of partnering with an outside developer to renovate aging public housing properties or to build new affordable rental housing properties. Now, since the start of the RAD program, about 250,000 public housing units have been converted through RAD or are in the pipeline to do so. More than 600 of those nearly 3,000 public housing authorities are or have participated in RAD. Now, before we go any farther, I do want to share with you some other ways to learn more about these issues. One opportunity is the Novogradac 2023 Housing Tax Credit Finance Conference. It's being held Thursday, November 30th and Friday, December 1st in Las Vegas. I encourage you to join us for that event. You can register for one or more of our pre-conference workshops as well. They're being held the day before on Wednesday, November 29th. The three workshops will be one on the low income tax credit basics. The second workshop is on year 15, the end of the 15-year compliance period. And the third workshop is on running the numbers, where you run through the sources and uses, net operating income, and exits of a low income tax credit development. I will include the registration information in today's show notes, but you can also simply Google Novogradac events. That should bring up a link to our conference registration page. Other resources that I recommend that you consider are getting a copy of the Novogradac Rental Assistance Demonstration Handbook. It provides insight and guidance to working on RAD developments. And the handbook was updated earlier this year, and the lead author, probably not a surprise to you, is my guest today, Rich Larsen. Novogradac also offers a booklet about HUD programs called the Introduction to HUD Multifamily Rental Housing Programs. As I noted, I'll provide a link to the conference as well as to the handbook and booklet in today's show notes. Now, as I mentioned earlier, my guest today is Rich Larsen from Novogradac's office in Toms River, New Jersey. Rich is the leader of our Public Housing Authority practice. And as I said, he's the lead author of our RAD handbook. Rich has more than 30 years of experience working with PHA and developer clients as an accountant, auditor, and consultant. And I will let Rich share a little bit more about his work in a moment. Now, today's episode, we're going to share an update on the RAD program, including a look at properties that are available under what's called Faircloth to RAD. After that, we'll discuss some RAD and HUD guidance that was provided for owners and operators of PHA and HUD finance properties. The guidance concerns solar power, as well as HUD's NSPIRE property compliance standards. We have a lot of useful insights to share today. So if you're ready, let's get started. Rich, welcome back to Tax Credit Tuesday.
Thanks, Mike. Very, very happy to be here.
It's always good to have you here. You're a very popular guest on Tax Credit Tuesday. Always get lots of downloads when you're a guest.
Wow, thanks. That's good to hear.
So you've been on the podcast several times. So I wanted to start today's episode allowing you to share with our audience a bit more about your background and areas of expertise, particularly as it relates to HUD and the topics we're going to discuss today.
Oh, great. Thanks, Mike. I'd be happy to share my resume. So primarily, I am an auditor of public housing authorities. In our Toms River office, we audit about 65 or 70 public housing authorities nationwide, and also their affiliate nonprofit and tax credit properties. We also are very involved in the RAD program. We provide transactional consulting for RAD transactions, entity structuring, REACT reporting, and we also do a lot with calculating impact of PHA guarantees. And we also will consult occasionally with PHAs on new accounting pronouncements. Recently, GASB 68 came out, 75, 87. So we do a lot of consulting as well with PHAs.
Well, I guess if I'm a PHA, know some of those GASB numbers you just mentioned,
Yeah.
maybe I should reach out to you.
Yes, you should. Yes, you should. They are all recent implementations.
So I'd like to start out today's discussion by looking at RAD. And I thought we could start with you just sharing with our audience a broad overview of where we stand with RAD right now.
Sure. So I guess with the most recent data from the RAD resource desk, and HUD maintains this website. So we've had over 171,000 public housing units have converted out of the public housing program into Section 8. We have another 55,000 or so in the pipeline, and about another 25,000 units are approved and reserved. I will say, however, there's still in excess of 200,000 units available under the RAD cap of 455,000 units available. And if you would have asked me in probably 2016 or 2017, I would have said, wow, we would have blown by that 455,000 unit cap a couple years ago at least. So undoubtedly, whether it be the pandemic, there has been a slowdown in RAD activity over the last several years.
Let me actually interrupt you there, because if you had asked me the same question back then, we kept talking about, when is the RAD cap going to be increased and when are we going to hit the
That's right.
cap and all the rest. So maybe you could share with our listeners what you think are some of the contributions to the slowdown in RAD. I mean, obviously a pandemic is an additive
Sure.
for
Yes.
development, but I suspect there's other factors as well.
Yes. And yeah, absolutely. So when the RAD first kicked off in 2012, a lot of those easier deals went first. The housing authorities that had projects with good cash flow, with high rents, moderate rehab needs. So those deals were easy to do. Some of these deals that are still out there, some of the housing authorities and in cities and so forth are a little harder to pencil out. So that's one factor. Um, the cost of materials and labor has increased significantly, forcing PHAs to really rework existing plans. And then a couple of HUD things have happened. HUD funding over the last few years has been the best it's ever been. So if your public housing subsidy is real good, there's less incentive to get out of that public housing program because you're really not pressured financially to convert your units. You're receiving a good subsidy, and that's been the case probably for the last 5 or 6 years. And of course, you touched on it, Mike. I feel like there's a COVID hangover affecting a lot of PHAs and the development pace. PHAs during COVID had um, high employee turnover. They had work from home, and I think that stalled a lot of development activities. So they're just getting their operations up and running smoothly again. But I do think we're going to start to see a real increase in RAD activity. I see some of those funding cuts, the public housing funding cuts down the road, and that's going to spur a lot of housing authorities to jump into the program. And, inflation is slowing, and I think you have more employee stability at housing authorities. So I do think we're going to see an uptick in the RAD activity.
Yeah, as we've discussed in the prior podcast, it definitely looks like the HUD funding will go challenged. over the next few years than it's been the last few years. So
Yes.
that folks can listen to one of our earlier podcasts. I'll put a link to it uh, in the show notes. But another RAD related opportunity is what's called Faircloth to RAD. And we've done prior podcasts
Right.
on that. But if you could
Right.
briefly explain to our listeners what the Faircloth to RAD opportunity is, and
Sure.
then how that's developed compared to what you had expected. And I suspect it hasn't fared as well as
Right.
we initially expected as well.
Right. So for our listeners, so the RAD program allows PHAs to rehab and convert existing public housing units. Faircloth to RAD actually allows PHAs to create new public housing units up to their Faircloth authority and then convert them to Section 8 contracts. Now Faircloth Authority was set up in was set in 1998 by Senator Faircloth, who put an amendment to the Housing Act that capped the number of public housing units a PHA could get subsidized. So there was a cap in 1998, but since then, a lot of PHAs lost public housing units because of a lack of funding and so forth. And so there's about 225,000 or so available units under this Faircloth authority that can be created through this new regulation. Um, Now, when this came out, the industry was abuzz that this is going to have a huge impact on affordable housing. Imagine creating another 225,000 affordable housing units. But the problem that has since emerged and why Faircloth has not been implemented throughout the country is that the biggest problem is that contract rent levels for Faircloth units are often too low. So when you do that conversion from public housing subsidy into the Section 8 program, that subsidy on the Faircloth units are low, and that's because the public housing subsidy is a little flawed when you're looking at new units. Because the operating expense level is so low on new units, the subsidy is low because the subsidy factors in your project expense level when you get that subsidy. So that's been the issue that's really put a damper on the Faircloth to RAD enthusiasm that came out when that regulation first was implemented. But now HUD has kind of answered that skepticism and those deficiencies in the program. And in order to bridge that gap, the coming between the public housing Faircloth rent and then getting it up to a Section 8 fair market rent, HUD is allowing public housing authorities to utilize Section 8 reserves, which is something they have not permitted in the past. And so now you can subsidize those rents on your Faircloth units and bring them up to a fair market rent, which now makes it much more uh, attractive, and they tend to pencil out a little bit better now. When you're looking at a RAD conversion, it'll be able to support a little bit more debt and so forth. And then there's the new MTW program, which HUD now is allowing some of those funds in your Move to Work program to be utilized as well in a RAD conversion. So I think this program will also start to really take off over the next few years with these changes.
So thanks. So thanks for that update about RAD and the Faircloth to RAD opportunity. But with both of those, if I'm a developer listening, or I'm a tax accountant auditor like myself listening, I'm thinking, okay, uh, there hasn't been as much activity as was anticipated. And obviously there's a lot of activity going on with RAD now, in spite of the fact that there's lots of room up to the cap. If I am a developer and I'm not participating in existing RAD transactions with Faircloth to RAD, are there certain things I should be watching for to know when those opportunities might, become greater?
Absolutely. I think that the current federal budget, if there are cutbacks, which I'm certain there will be, we have, with a new Congress. I shouldn't say I'm certain with anything in politics, but I'm pretty comfortable that there will be some domestic spending cutbacks, and especially in the HUD area. And when that happens, the public housing subsidy is the first thing to get cut, and that will spur some housing authorities to jump into the RAD program because they're going to want to convert while that subsidy is high because that results in a higher RAD rent. Um, Plus, I think, you're seeing a little bit more labor availability right now. Hopefully, interest rate uh, will not jump up so much, and I think that could spur on some more growth as well in the RAD program. But most important thing I tell a lot of developers is, the area that you want to work in, there may be 5, 6 housing authorities. Maybe it's New Jersey, which has 80 housing authorities. You want to make a phone call and get on their procurement list because they will always, when they're looking for developer, they will put out a request for qualifications, an RFQ. And if you're on that list, you're going to automatically get it. If you're not, you could miss it. So wherever you want to work, I would look up the PHAs in that area and make sure you're on that RFQ list.
That's very good advice. And I mentioned the sort of concerns and when a developer might be focused on opportunities here. But as you noted, public housing authorities should be looking at those same guidelines and thinking when they have the opportunity, when's the right time for them to be more focused on RAD or Faircloth to RAD. But I wanted to shift gears a bit and I'll still overlap with the PHA world. But as I noted in the intro, HUD recently released updated guidance on the effects or impact of installing solar panels at public housing authority owned and HUD assisted housing. As you know, Rich, there have been concerns among public housing authorities and other property owners as to the effect of adding solar, the effect it would have on the rental subsidies that the properties would receive, as well as the rents that would be charged to tenants. So if you could share with listeners what HUD's guidance addresses and,
Sure.
and how it hopefully helps resolve some of these concerns so we can see more solar installations at PHAs and HUD assisted housing.
Sure. And I'll give a little background to our listeners as
Please.
well. So most tenants in public housing buildings or HUD assisted properties receive an income-based subsidy. So that is the lower their income, the lower the rent, the higher the subsidy the owner will get. Some tenants also in public housing receive utility allowances. That is, a reimbursement to cover some of their utility costs. Well, there really wasn't much guidance out there on if if a tenant receives a solar benefit in the form of a check or reduced utility bills, how will that affect the calculation of their income and the calculation of their utility allowance, which in effect is money in their pocket. So if in essence, if a client is or if a tenant is getting, $100 subsidy and then they go and get a solar credit and now they're only going to get a $70 subsidy, is it is it really worth it for the housing authority or the HUD assisted property to pursue solar credits? And then if they happen to take a position that was contrary to what HUD may come out with in the future, it could cost them monetarily through penalties and a recapture of some subsidy. But now with this new guidance that has come out, HUD has done a nice job in clarifying how a solar benefit has to be passed on to the tenant. And, we don't have to go into all the points of that right now, but you should know and consult with your solar advisor or your HUD auditor or consultant to make sure that that subsidy you're receiving or that solar credit you're receiving, you're reporting it right. And you want it so that it has minimal effect on your tenant and so they can maximize their subsidy. And I think HUD did a nice job of clarifying that anyway, and given guidance and some protection to those doing those calculations, subsidy calculations.
So thank you for that, Rich. And I would just encourage listeners to reach out to Rich as well. Uh, he's a little bit bashful. I'm
Yeah,
not suggesting you reach out directly to him, but I encourage you to
yeah,
reach out to him as well to better understand the impact of adding solar to HUD assisted or public housing authority owned properties. And I like the fact that Richie kind of pointed out, we weren't quite sure what, how it would affect tenant incomes and the rents that
That's right.
tenants pays and rents that get charged, but also that if you did it wrong,
That's
you would
right.
run the risk of penalties and the rest. And it becomes a bit of a, you don't want to be, going there. So I can see how it slowed down the uptake of solar on these types of properties. But let's
That's right.
beyond the solar guidance. In late September, HUD announced that their rollout of HUD's NSPIRE, the acronym NSPIRE, property compliance standards, are going to be delayed for a year. Now, I don't want to go into details about those
Sure.
standards. We're going to have Stephanie Knock in a future podcast to talk more about NSPIRE. But if you could explain at a high level
Sure.
what NSPIRE is and what the guidance does for PHAs and owners of affordable housing properties.
Sure. So prior to Inspire, um, if if you had a public housing property, if you were a housing authority at a public housing property, and you also did inspections on Section 8 units, there were two different assessment methodologies that you had to understand and learn. Um, so what Inspire does, it just consolidates those two. It implements a national standard and scoring methodology for the physical inspection of properties assisted or insured by HUD. We can get into details, but it prioritizes health and safety and functional defects over appearance. And you'll get a numerical score. Um, Less than 60 points is a fail, but if you're in the housing choice voucher program, you will just get the pass fail. But if you're in the public housing, you'll actually get the number score.
So
And
maybe you can
and that,
just,
that's it on a high level.
right, maybe just, do you just talk about the effective date? Because basically
Sure.
the old,
Yeah.
the older or existing, I guess, not old, the existing standards will be in effect, quote, for another year. But as accountants, we know there's calendar years, there's fiscal years. Then you can explain what the delay
So
means, and then we'll let Stephanie talk more about the Inspire when she's on.
sure. So for public housing and multifamily programs, you're going to start July 1 on your new inspections. For HCV, for housing choice voucher and project-based voucher, you're going to be October 1, 2023 is the start date. And then the other programs will be delayed another year into October 2024.
Got it. Thank you for that. So we've talked about RAD, Faircloth to RAD, the solar guidance, the Inspire guidance. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with listeners before we bring the podcast to a close?
Mike, we do have the tax credit finance conference in Las Vegas coming up. It's a great opportunity to talk with other affordable housing providers. So that's always something I like to promote. And I won't be bashful. Please, you can give me a call if you have any questions about things we talked about today. I'd love to hear from you. You can email me, get my email off the website. It's rich.larsen@novaco.com. And I'd love to hear from you.
Great. And that's RICH.LARSEN at
Ian,
Novavax versus SM.
novaco.com. Yes,
So thank you, Rich. Please stick around for our off mic section. I get
absolutely.
to ask you some fun off topic questions. And I would like to encourage our audience to tune in again next week and to all of our future episodes of Tax Prep Tuesday. Also encourage you to browse at some of our past episodes. You can follow us or subscribe to us, however you get your podcasts. So please do that. And if you have any ideas or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at cpas@novaco.com. So now we get to go to our off mic section. So Rich, I am, as you know, I'm a big book reader.
Yeah.
I've not been watching as many movies lately. So I thought I would, rather than ask you about a book recommendation, I thought I'd ask you about a recent movie, or even not so recent, but if you had a movie recommendation that I and our listeners should consider.
Absolutely. I love the movie Air. It starred Matt Damon, and I think it was directed by Ben Affleck. And that has to do with the origin of the Air Jordan sneaker and how it made Nike into the company that it is today, and how it made Michael Jordan into the billionaire he is today. It's an incredible story. I just from a business perspective,
Mhm.
his looking at his parents, how smart they were in cutting these deals. It really is an incredible story. I really enjoyed the movie. I recommend it wholeheartedly.
Very good. I will look forward to seeing it. And then we mentioned the conference coming up in about 6 weeks in Las Vegas, Affordable Housing
Oh,
Conference. And I was wondering if you had some tips for people to get the most out of that conference or just conferences in
sh-
general.
sure. I mean the sessions are always spot on with industry leaders giving their insight. But I always felt the networking in between sessions, and the cocktail hours always provided me the most value. Um, for an example, if you're a PHA or executive director of a PHA and you come to this conference and you're looking to convert utilizing the RAD program, convert your public housing units, there's a good chance that there may be several EDs at the conference who can share their experience with you. Or you can probably talk to some of the top developers if you're looking for a developer, syndicator, consultants in the industry. The practical advice and the knowledge you gain, I think really is invaluable. It just makes so much sense. You just pick up little things that you can't read in the book or you can't find on the HUD website. And I just find conversations like that to be the most valuable part of our Novogradac conference.
Thank you for that, Rich. I agree 100%. And as I've said in prior episodes, listeners, I'd also encourage you downloading the Novogradac app if it's a Novogradac event. And through the app, you can actually chat with other attendees. You can see who's attending and chat with them, send them a text through the app. And in that way, you could actually, in advance of going to the conference, start reaching out to conference attendees and set up meetings and the rest. So that's a great way
That's
to
right.
pre-party, if you will, or pre-conference that doesn't involve a adult beverage. So thank you, Rich. I appreciate you joining me on the podcast.
Thank you, Mike.
And to our listeners, I'm Mike Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novaco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novaco.com/podcast. Novogradac and Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novaco.com.